For more on the United Nations General Assembly, we now speak to Thembisa Fakude, who is the Director at Africa-Asia Dialogues, and he joins us via our Zoom link. Thembisa, thank you so much for joining us here on the late edition. Of course, one would say, let's just start off with what we've just heard from President Cyril Ramaphosa, the issue there, the call for transforming the global financial institutions.
Yeah, so President Cyril Ramaphosa has been very clear in this regard that the current multilateral platforms need to be revamped, and he has specifically prioritized the United Nations Security Council, as you heard in the clip, that deserves to be transformed, and other multilateral platforms, particularly those that deals with the economy. The only challenge, of course, is that South Africa has tended to punch much more way above its weight. I'm not sure whether we are ready to be sitting at the United Nations Security Council, given the poor borders that we have, given the ill-preparedness when it comes to domestic security. And here we are wanting to join a club that decides who lives and who dies. That requires, a candidate that's really fit for purpose, ready to protect itself first before you join in clubs that might just anger or irritate certain people who might just, feel aggrieved and somehow retaliate. And whether we're ready for that or not, I'm of the view that we're not ready. And as a result, I think we should be looking at other multilateral platforms instead of prioritizing the United Nations Security Council.
And one would say that a number of African countries complaining about the UN Security Council. Why do you think that South Africa is not ready to actually join the Security Council, even though we've seen calls even from Naledi Pandor, the Minister of International Relations, calling for the reform of the Security Council?
Well, we've seen the mistakes that have been made by the Security Council in the past, whether it's the wars in Libya and in Iraq, and other decisions that were placed before the United Nations Security Council. And often, those kind of decisions involves the military intervention. And that military intervention, unfortunately, might just trigger a response. And I'm of the view that we are not ready yet to be sitting in that, because we're not prepared. I mean, our borders are just violated on a daily basis. Domestically, we don't even know what's going on. And here we are exposing ourselves to a much more, a bigger threat that is making decisions, for example, to go against certain people who are deemed to be destabilizing the world. To what extent are we capable of protecting themselves should they decide to retaliate for whatever reason? So that, for me, is one reason why I think we should hang 10 in terms of joining the United Nations Security Council. I think there are a lot of other multilaterals that we should prioritize. I think we should lead, for example, on just energy transition, this global human trafficking, immigration challenges that we see happening. We've got a lot of challenges in South Africa because of the South-South migration, and a lot of Africans who are crossing the Mediterranean seeking better economic opportunities elsewhere. So there are a lot of other multilateral platforms where we could be leading, instead of us joining the club of, as I've said, that decides who lives or and who dies.
And Thembisa, something that has also come out from this meeting of world leaders is the issue around the SDG and that declaration that has been signed, and particularly that stimulus that many of these nations have, even adopted and declared on that issue. Do you think that these commitments will be met, especially with the consideration that there has been much criticism there when it comes to SDGs?
Well, I think there's a commitment on at least trying to fulfill certain objectives towards achieving the SDGs, but we don't see any movement. These were declared quite some time ago, and since we have seen, in fact, the deterioration of the socio-political and economic, including cultural situations around the world. So there is commitment, but we don't see much of those objectives achieved, and maybe what we need, we perhaps need some report back with some gauge of what has been achieved so far. But from where I sit, I don't see any movement. The United Nations Security Council, the United Nations General Assembly often emphasize the achievement of SDGs, but all we see is rhetoric year in, year out, and very less achievements are reported back to the world. And hopefully this time around, of course, again, we're going to have that amplification for the rest of this week. But it's back to business as usual for many countries as soon as they finish or get out of New York. And that's unfortunate.
And of course, President Cyril Ramaphosa being in the U.S., one would say, following that report about Lady R, one can also ask, can we expect some sort of bilaterals between the U.S. President Joe Biden and President Cyril Ramaphosa, considering the remarks which were made by the U.S. ambassador in South Africa? Something also the president touching on there in that meeting with business leaders in the U.S. And of course, some of those from South Africa. Is this something we can expect from these two leaders?
I think so. I think the relationship between President Cyril Ramaphosa and Joe Biden remains very strong. They both sit on the G20. Even, of course, Cyril Ramaphosa has been the only African leader for a very long time, and that spotlight has been dimmed by the inclusion of the African Union. But the communication between the two leaders, I think, continues, and I think they are set to continue improving that. AGOA is likely to be renewed, notwithstanding that South Africa has made, and the U.S. ambassador to South Africa have had, there have been loggerheads for various reasons, including the Lady R saga, but we are likely to see that improving. But again, South Africa tends to punch way above its weight. We heard from Cyril Ramaphosa as well, talking about, United States needs South Africa as much as South Africa needs United States. Well, that's questionable. For a country like ours that's suffering from high unemployment rate, etc., I think we should be going to these meetings with a different rhetoric and a different presentation, instead of us, again, presenting ourselves as if we can do without these big countries, has always been the case. The saddest part is that, you hardly hear that type of rhetoric towards Russia or China. It's often against the European countries or the US, and these are the countries that actually are dealing or have got a much more larger cooperation in terms of economics with South Africa compared to Russia, China, and India for that matter. But we've always hear this flexing of muscles when it comes to the European Union, as if, the European countries and the US, as if we can actually really survive without them.
Quite interesting there, Thembisa. At the same time, we know that the president of the Ukraine is also part of the UN General Assembly meeting that is underway in the US. Do you think that somehow this, because of the geopolitical tensions, this will overshadow the entire, United Nations General Assembly?
Well, I don't think Ukraine this time around is going to dominate discussions. I think we've already seen protests in New York from the green activists or the environmental activists already. We have two big events that occurred before this gathering, which is the earthquake in Morocco and the floods in Derna in Libya. And those two, again, are very urgent and they are pressing. And I think we are likely to have them dominating the discussions. Not long ago, yesterday, there was the 7,000 migrants who crossed the Mediterranean into Lampedusa in Italy. And that in itself, again, is another challenge which I think require immediate intervention by the United Nations General Assembly. Today, we heard about the release, the 5 prisoners swap between the United States and Iran. So there's a lot going on. And I think whatever is happening at the moment at UN General Assembly is likely to be overshadowed by all of these events that are taking place on the side.
All right, then, Thembisa Fakude, thank you so much for your time. Always a pleasure to talk to you here on the Late Edition. That is Thembisa Fakude. He is the Director of Africa-Asia Dialogue.